but maybe we're not necessarily accepting it as being valid because it comes from the non-English speaking world.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and going back to thinking about development, so one of the things we can do is think about how we can increase ground reaction forces by doing things like higher depth jumps. And then I think the other big one too is thinking of whether you do double leg or single leg. But then the other big factor then too is how we reduce the contact time as well. And I know, like for you, like typically we're going to use that with doing certain types of cueing, particularly.
Yeah. We obviously, like in our discussion, we spoke about the cueing in our one of our previous discussions on the sensory motor control and how that kind of comes together with changing skills. And obviously you would potentially use different ways of doing it. Maybe you're using some sort of external cueing, or you use some sort of constraint where you actually remove the capability of the athlete to spend time on the ground, whether that's, if they're running and you're placing, say, wickets or cones, in their way, so they actually can't spend any time on the ground before they need to re-coordinate themselves.
Or like a really hot surface.
Yeah, like the surface of the sun, Jack. But I think that starts to give people the indication of, okay, like there's a couple of parameters that we're looking for here. Obviously, the output, the forces that they create and the, potentially the jump height they're creating is important, but also how quickly can they create that? Yeah. And I think that starts to change the mentality a bit. Obviously, we do a lot of jump testing to look at some of those elastic features. And there's probably two areas that we spend more time on than I think what people... or even, the people we're testing probably don't even consider, like they're all often asking like, oh, are you measuring the height? And most of the time it's like, no, we're not measuring the height. We're measuring how long you're on the ground. So your ground contact. And typically the other big thing that I know you mentioned just then was, the difference between single and double leg is massive. And even if you're not going from a high height, even if it's only say 15 centimeters, getting an idea of how well someone is able to, create the ability to stabilize and then use elastic capabilities off a single limb really starts to change your understanding of how well someone can control their limbs under ground reaction forces.
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned before for team sports, to me, I think that's the big area that probably needs to be explored a hell of a lot more to get an indication of why we're seeing, the joint injuries we still see. I think that's probably part of it.
And the other element to consider is the ability to do these type of tasks in different planes, so vertical, horizontal, and lateral. Because again, most field sports are going to be multi-directional.
Yeah,
I think the other thing to consider too is, like I know for the way that we approach it is, this allows you to then more successfully assess the whole force velocity spectrum. And I think that's obviously a really important component from both performance and rehabilitation perspective.
Well, I think we need to highlight this. It's not saying that we're not measuring things like their force output or their strength at a maximal level, even if it's in, something like an isometric mid-thigh pull. We are looking at those things. It's just that when you start to look at the very dynamic nature of sport, particularly, if you're not measuring that very fast end, you're probably